I had never used deodorant, and I didn't understand why she was handing it to me now. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked with a bit of confusion. "Because you stink," she said, and she started laughing. A few other people in the office laughed too, but I could tell that they felt a bit bad for me. The longer I stayed at Flag, the more I could feel her drifting away. Finally, in the fall of 1995, when I was getting toward the end of LOC, Mom told everyone in the office her news. Uncle Dave had offered her a position in RTC, the Religious Technology Center at the INT base. The RTC was the highest governing body of the church, and was responsible for policing ethics violators and upholding the proper application and use of Scientology materials and technology. Not only was this a huge honor, it meant that she would be back home on the West Coast with Dad, Justin, Sterling, and me. She seemed hesitant, saying she really didn't want to be in RTC, as she liked her current job, but she acknowledged that since Uncle Dave had made the offer, she couldn't say no. Everybody showered her with gifts at her going-away party. The staff at Flag really seemed to love her, and gave her a whole living room set, including an ornate white couch, an antique trunk, a hutch, and a few other items. That week, I planned to add my own celebration for Mom as well. Some Fridays after the graduation ceremonies, I'd put on some kind of show for Mom and the various Scientology executives that she entertained at her apartment. My performances were kind of ridiculous. One Friday, I did an out-of-fashion fashion show, where I put on Mom's clothes and paraded around. Another time, I did a tap dance show, even though I had no clue as to how to tap dance. And so, in celebration for Mom's move back to INT, I plotted my biggest show ever for the Friday night post-graduation crowd at Mom's. I made a whole cardboard structure and sewed an outfit for myself out of kitchen rags. I painted Valeska's and my faces and was just about ready to clean things up when Mom came home early. She was furious that the house was filthy and the people were coming over, and she started yelling at me. She said that I was dressed with nothing more than a kitchen rag, that there was trash everywhere, that I had a CMO staff member getting cardboard for me when he should have been on post, and that I was spoiled. She turned on Valeska next. "And you," she barked, "grow up." Valeska clearly felt ridiculous with her face painted and a silly hat on her head and almost burst into tears. Mom signaled to her to leave, and she did. I had never yelled at my mother before, but I couldn't stand to see her treat Valeska like that, or me. I told her that I was not afraid of her like other people were. I even cussed at her several times, telling her we were just trying to put on a show for her benefit, and that we had been about to clean up when she burst in. She screamed back at me not to cuss at her, and I shouted at her not to yell at me. After some vicious back and forth that brought us both to tears, she finally turned to me with a heavy sigh. "I'm sorry, Jenna," she said. "Give me a hug. I really am sorry." Emotional and exhausted, I looked at her. We'd never had a fight like this, so we'd never had to make up like this either. Reluctantly, I gave her a hug. That night, her friends still came over as planned, and Mom acted as though nothing had happened. A few days later, we boarded a plane bound for the West Coast, INT, and the ranch. Chapter 13. The Golden Age of Technology. I returned to the ranch with new confidence. It was hard to say whether it was because I'd finally finished the Key to Life and LOC courses successfully, because of all the excitement about the Sea Org that I'd experienced at Flag, or simply because I was getting older, but the end result was an optimism I'd never felt before. Part of my enthusiasm came from the fact that at the end of the LOC course, I'd been tasked with finding my purpose, or my hat in life, as Scientologists say. I'd begun talking with Mom about this and asking her lots of questions about the different Sea Org roles she'd had. From those discussions, I decided that I wanted to be in the Commodore's Messenger Office, the CMO, which offered a new clarity and focus to everything. Although I still had to graduate from the ranch before I could join the CMO, for the first time I had a plan for what I wanted to do with my life. Now all I had to do was follow the rules. In truth, following the rules felt a lot easier now. Even deck work, which I hadn't done in ages because I'd been at Flag, didn't seem as bad. I was nearly twice the age I had been when I'd first arrived at the ranch, and I was much more able to do physical work. I even started receiving praise for being a hard worker, something I wasn't used to. My old post as medical liaison had been taken by someone else in my absence, so my new post put me in charge of the harvest, making sure certain fields were properly harvested, but soon I was promoted to the head of Division 2, an executive position. In this role, my duty was to oversee the children's group. One of the changes that had been made since I'd arrived was that there was no longer a pre-cadet category, only cadets and children. Among my responsibilities, I had to make sure the children under my care made it to morning muster on time, had good hygiene, were ethical, and did their deck work. Some of them were well behaved, some of them weren't. I wanted to build good relationships with all of them. I hadn't forgotten what it was like to be their age, living at the ranch. I nurtured them as best I could. If they came to me and told me they didn't like the post they were assigned, I would try to help them find a post that suited them better. Their posts were simple, things like supplying the dorms with toilet paper, picking up trash, or gathering vegetables, but I tried to work it so that everybody was happy. I took my post seriously and was even recognized as Cadet of the Week. My academic schooling wasn't going as well, though. I was almost 2 years behind because of the time I had spent at Flag receiving no academic education. One of the results of my experiences at Flag was that now I only wanted to do Scientology studies, since I knew that to be a Sea Org member, those were what really mattered. When I argued with my course supervisor that academics were not that important, she escorted me to a small storage room where the books were kept. She was only 18 or 19, although she was much bigger than I. I started fighting to get out, but she punched me in the face pretty hard. I only got a small bruise, and I didn't complain to anybody at the ranch. However, when I did tell my mother, she just asked me what I had done to deserve it. I wondered if she would speak to someone about it, but I was too afraid to ask, because she seemed to think it was my fault. In the evenings, I was assigned to audit a girl named Trisha on her clay table. The two of us would go to the int base at night with the food run, and I would audit her after dinner. It wasn't too difficult, because she was a friend and pretty easygoing. Being at int most nights meant that there were more opportunities for me to run into Uncle Dave. One time after course, he came to pick me up on his motorcycle. We drove to his office, where I chatted with my Aunt Shelly, and I played with his dogs. He took pictures of me at his desk answering the phone, pretending that I ran the world. For all that he was the head of the church and a powerful figure who inspired fear, moments like these showed a normal side to him. There were times when I could tell he just wanted to be a fun, normal uncle, goofing around with his niece, and in these moments, it was almost possible to see some sort of longing for a family, a humanity that was hidden much of the time. From how he treated me, it seemed apparent that he didn't want me to be afraid of him in the way that most adults were. Sadly, these tender moments were going to become fewer and farther between. As the years went on, I saw that side of him less and less, and perhaps, given how he eventually seemed to change for the worse, it eventually ceased to exist entirely. But I never have forgotten Uncle Dave's gentle, human side. I stayed in touch via letter with all of my friends at Flag, especially Valeska, Tom, Jenny, even Don and Pilar. My dad would sometimes make comments about the letters I received from Don, saying things like, "Did you get your letter from your best friend, Don?" He'd say it in a weird, jealous tone, but I would just ignore it. It wasn't just those comments that struck me as odd. It seemed like my parents were arguing a lot, and that the arguments were getting worse. Christmas was at Uncle Dave's apartment at the int base that year. Mom and Dad got Dave an expensive pen, and Mom got a cute green Ann Taylor suit from him and Aunt Shelly. Aunt Shelly told me I should not get too enmeshed in fashion, as it was a bit of a trap. She also sat me down and talked to me about issues like skin and acne. I was having lots of breakouts and pimples and didn't really know how to take care of my face. Aunt Shelly suggested some natural solutions to help me clear it up. Although it was embarrassing, I was thankful for her guidance. Soon after Christmas, a policy change went into effect that kids could no longer stay at their parents' birthing on Saturday nights. I was ambivalent about the change. I had always liked going to my parents' birthing. Staying at the apartment was so much nicer than staying at the ranch. If this had occurred just a few years earlier, I would have been devastated. My parents were now living on the INT base, which meant I didn't really get to see my friends on Saturday night and Sunday mornings anyway, so I wasn't really too bummed about the change. My dad was furious, though. It meant that family time was even more limited, and if parents wanted to see their children, they had to come to the ranch, making it difficult for most of them because they had to take the bus. They also lost the Sunday morning time to go shopping with their kids for socks, underwear, toiletries, and such. I was still allowed to go to INT on Sunday mornings, but I didn't go as often. Justin and I didn't see each other much anymore. He'd officially joined the Sea Org, so he was living and working at INT. When I did see him, he didn't have much to say to me. Therefore, I was surprised when Taryn approached me one afternoon, anxious to share good news with me about my brother. Like Justin, she was also working at the INT base as a Sea Org member. "Aren't you so excited that Justin decided to stay?" she exclaimed, waiting for me to agree. When I looked baffled, she could tell I had no idea what she was talking about. She brought me aside. "Justin has wanted to leave the Sea Org for several years," she told me quietly, "but your dad finally convinced him to stay." As I heard these words, I couldn't make my mind up as to which was more shocking, that my brother had contemplated leaving, or that Taryn was telling me about it. In the Sea Org, you were forbidden to talk about leaving or even hearing that someone else was considering leaving. If you did, it was considered a suppressive act, so just by her telling me, she was taking a huge risk. Aside from telling someone that you were thinking of leaving, other high crimes that might be considered suppressive acts were things like talking negatively about Scientology, practicing Scientology outside the umbrella organization, asking for your money back, taking legal action against Scientology, or speaking or writing negatively about Scientology to members of the media. Suppressive acts could cause you to be declared a suppressive person, an SP. If this happened, you were considered evil, and people who were still Scientologists had to disconnect from you in every way, or they would be considered SPs too. As I turned over Taryn's words, things started to make more sense. I knew that Justin had been unhappy. He always seemed to be in trouble for one thing or another, even when he wasn't doing anything wrong, so the idea that he'd contemplated leaving wasn't a total shock. However, there was a big difference between contemplating it and almost doing it. Until now, I hadn't realized just how close I'd come to losing a family member. I wouldn't have been able to have any kind of relationship with him. It scared me that I had come so close to losing someone I loved. In the end, I felt relieved that it hadn't happened, but I also hadn't known enough to worry about it. Everyone seemed to know about his discontent except me. It was the first time I'd heard of someone this close to me doubting their commitment to the Sea Org. It wouldn't be the last. On May 9th, 1996, the day we would celebrate Dianetics Day, Uncle Dave was going to unveil the next great steps in the future of Scientology. Scientology, he said, was undergoing a renaissance of sorts, and he had decided that there was imperfections in the way people were being audited. As a result, he wanted to improve the training program for auditors with new, more sophisticated e-meters and perfected auditing drills, thus enabling Scientologists to ascend the bridge to total freedom more thoroughly and efficiently. These improvements were going to be called the Golden Age of Technology, and from now on, they would help train Scientologists to be perfect auditors. One of the changes brought on by this Golden Age of Technology was that new e-meters were going to be created for training auditors. In the past, the check sheets that had been used for training auditors asked the coach to squeeze the cans to simulate e-meter readings for the student. Now, instead of having a coach squeeze the cans, there was an actual machine on which one could push buttons and the desired reading would show up. With these better e-meters and the heightened training that these new procedures produced, for the first time the process of teaching auditors would be flawless, so the auditors would be flawless as well. I was very excited to be among a small group of cadets chosen to help on the Golden Age of Tech's new e-meter, called the Mark Super 7 Quantum, manufactured by a division of Golden Era Productions. Golden Era Productions, or GOLD as it was called, was responsible for the worldwide dissemination of Scientology, including all films, videos, television, internet, and international event production. It also produced the tapes of LRH's lectures and other materials, such as the e-meter, training devices, and anything else that needed to deliver Scientology to the public and staff. It was headquartered at the INT base and staffed by several hundred Sea Org members, many of whom were parents to kids at the ranch. The first morning, we were driven by bus to the base after breakfast. The team was going to be assembling the new e-meters in Building 36, Hubbard E-Meter Manufacturing, Heme. The place was buzzing, as we needed to get the machines ready for the May 9th launch date. Tons of staff were working there, even people from other posts who had come to help. We were divided into different sections along the line, so I was never in one section for more than a couple of weeks during the nearly year-long assignment, during which time I got to work in every section. I started off hot stamping the plastic e-meter casings with dial numbers and letters, and ended up in QC, Quality Control, where my job was to catch any glitches in the finished product. There were only 3 of us in QC, and we had to plug the finished e-meters into all sorts of machines and do tests at different settings. Heme had a certain quota to make, and we were getting closer each day as May 9th approached. Every time an e-meter passed through the QC department, we would ring a bell and everyone would cheer. Working in QC was sometimes exciting and sometimes nerve-wracking. Throughout the day, senior executives would come through to inspect our work. There was a period of time when I was rejecting many e-meters, so the execs brought in a technical guy to see if the problem was with my inspections or the meters. The tech expert concluded that the e-meters were problem-free, so it must have been me. I stood my ground, insisting the meters were faulty based on the standard tests I had done. I even demonstrated the problem to several executives, and when it turned out that I was correct, I was praised for persevering. The e-meter assembly project went on for a few months. Mom was often the inspector. She would give me a hug and check on me, then go on her way. I was impressed by how everyone seemed to love and respect her while also fearing her. In the Sea Org, this was called ethics presence, which was essentially a combination of fear and respect, both of which were considered necessary to get compliance. Because we were already accustomed to working long hours, it really was no sweat, and working at a desk was much easier than deck work at the ranch. When we worked at Heme, we stayed there all day, only going home in the evening in time for dinner, followed by studies. I was still in charge of the children until they went to bed. Once demand for the new e-meters had subsided to a manageable level after the celebration of Dianetics Day, we resumed our normal schedules at the ranch, but being a part of the e-meters only added to the sense of progress that I'd built, a sense that came to a halt just as I was settling into things at the ranch. One day, out of the blue, it was announced that from this point forward, all cadets had to be higher on the bridge before they could graduate from the ranch and become Sea Org members. This was another part of the church's plan to make perfect auditors. The problem for me was that it could take years to become a Class V auditor, which meant it could take years for me to graduate. The news came as a huge surprise and disappointment for all the kids, but I had a particularly hard time with it. Ever since I'd returned from Flag, I'd been making continuous improvements. I had more responsibility and felt like I'd been building momentum. For months, I'd been taking comfort in my Hat in Life plan I'd put together to join the Commodore's Messengers Organization, CMO, after graduation. That plan had offered me a sense of direction, not to mention excitement about the future. Having to become a Class V auditor changed things completely. Now it could be years before I'd get to realize that plan. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But as most every Scientologist learns at some point, these kinds of adjustments are all too typical. Just as I'd been getting into a rhythm and just when I'd figured out the rules, they changed them. A few weeks later, at my brother Sterling's wedding, I had a chance to talk to Aunt Shelly about it. I told her I was very upset about the new graduation requirement. She explained to me that she thought that auditor training was the greatest thing in the world if you really wanted to learn how to help other people. She said that the finest CMO messengers were trained auditors, and Uncle Dave himself had become an auditor at a very young age. The way she framed it made it sound sensible, and her words calmed me down. At the very least, she'd made it sound more exciting. After all, the way to clear the planet was through Scientology auditors, and our goal as Sea Org members was to bring everyone on the planet to a state of clear. Only then could we be at peace. Still, it seemed like a lot of work and a lot more years. Even though I was still frustrated, I turned my focus to Sterling and Suzette's wedding. Suzette was actually Aunt Shelly's half-sister. My mother didn't like her very much for some reason. I got along with her better than I did with Sterling, as Sterling and I hadn't had a chance to get very close. He had left the ranch to work in the Sea Org at INT some years earlier, and prior to that, when he was at the ranch, he had been much closer to his younger brother Nathan. I was the flower girl, and Justin the best man. I thought I was a little too old to be the flower girl, though. The event was being held at the Celebrity Center in Los Angeles, as were most Sea Org weddings. That Sunday morning, Justin rehearsed his best man speech in the car during the entire drive down from INT. When we arrived, I went into the dressing room where all the bridesmaids were gathered. Aunt Shelly helped me get into my dress and put the floral wreath on my head. Her other sisters, Clarice and Camille, were tending to Suzette. Sterling and Suzette's wedding was a traditional ceremony, with the bride in white and an exchange of vows. There were about 100 people in attendance. A Scientology wedding ceremony also included the ARC triangle, the letters of which stood for affinity, reality, and communication. The ARC triangle was a fundamental Scientology concept of how to get along with people and build understanding relationships. It stressed the importance of communication, which was applicable to marriage, with the ceremony having the bride and groom promise that they will never go to bed without resolving an argument. After the ceremony, we all watched Sterling and Suzette open their gifts. On a Sunday morning following the wedding, I told my mother that I really missed my friends at Flag, and that I was bummed about not being able to graduate until I did my auditor training. To my surprise, she said that she would let me visit there, and even stay long enough to do a course. Though I was intrigued by the prospect of this, I was over the moon when she suggested that I do my entire auditor training program at Flag. Flag, she explained, had the best auditor training on the planet, and this would probably mean spending a year in Florida. I had never intended to stay that long, but I figured I wouldn't be held to it, so I agreed immediately. My father didn't like the idea of me being gone for so long, saying he would miss me too much, but he didn't stop me from going. The next few weeks at the ranch were just about counting the minutes until I could board a plane to Flag. As I waited to leave, Mr. C got me even more excited about the auditor training. He told me I'd have a thrilling time as the program led to personal miracles. Remembering the story of one course in particular, he told me that when he was finished, he was suddenly able to play the piano, something he had never been able to do before in this lifetime. The prospect of discovering a hidden talent was very alluring. After this course, I thought, anything might be possible. Chapter 14. CMO Training. Things were odd from the moment I landed in Clearwater that June afternoon in 1996. Tom, who was supposed to meet me at the airport, was nowhere to be seen. I had no money, no phone number for him or anyone else, and I was starting to get really worried. There I was at Tampa International Airport without a backup plan. When Tom finally arrived an hour later, he looked happy enough to see me, but somewhat distracted. He apologized, saying he had gotten the arrival time wrong. He thought the flight landed an hour later than it did. During the ride to the base, he seemed in a hurry and a bit preoccupied, although he was still nice. When we got to the hacienda, he drove right by Mom's condo, where I thought I would be staying, and pulled up in front of the H block, where the CMO dormitories were. I was not sure what was happening at first. "I don't get to live over in L block?" I asked, confused. He laughed and said, "No, that is for senior execs from INT." "Oh," I said, suddenly wondering what I had actually signed up for. The whole time I'd imagined living at Flag, it had never occurred to me that I wouldn't be living in Mom's old apartment. It had never occurred to me that I was going to be in a dorm. We got out of the car, got my bags out of the trunk, and walked up to the door of apartment H2 on the ground floor. I remembered this being Valeska's apartment, but even she wasn't there. In fact, Tom told me that she was no longer in the CMO, so she had a different berthing. He offered no explanation, and I didn't ask. He seemed to be in a rush to go somewhere, so he said I should probably unpack my stuff and get some rest. And then he was gone. The H block was a dormitory for girls in CMO. Most of them were 15 or 16, not 12, as I was. Apartment H2 had 2 bedrooms, with 3 girls in each one bathroom, and a small kitchen. Diane, my old twin from my first Key to Life course, now lived there and was going to be one of my apartment mates. The girls didn't seem to know why I was living in H2, as I had told them I was only a cadet, and the cadets didn't live in CMO berthings. They were supposed to live at the cadet org. I said I didn't know why I was there either. I thought I was going to be at Mom's apartment, and had been looking forward to it. Now I was on my own. I claimed the bathroom for a quick shower. A girl banged on the door 5 times and shouted at me to hurry up. When I got out, one of the girls was mouthing off at me for taking too long. It seemed pretty harsh for a new place. I just walked away without saying anything. When I went to lie down for a short rest, there were no sheets on my bed. Being too shy to ask, I almost burst into grateful tears when Diane saw that I needed linens and showed me where to get them. I still didn't know where I was supposed to go after this. Tom had told me nothing. Things were not off to a good start, and it was very possible that I had made a huge mistake by coming back to Flag. I tossed and turned for 30 minutes, and finally decided to walk over to Don's place in the H block to see if he knew the plan for me. He was the only person whose location I knew. He seemed genuinely happy to see me and gave me a hug. He said he had no idea either, but that he would take me to the WB and that someone there would certainly know. Don drove a white convertible Mustang, a cool car according to my mother, but I didn't know anything about cars. At the WB, I went straight to Tom's office on the 3rd floor. He greeted me warmly when I came in, then instructed one of his messengers to get me a uniform. I was taken aback when the woman returned with a blue uniform, the type all the Sea Org members wore. I thought I was here for an auditor course and had no idea why I was getting a Sea Org uniform. Before I could ask Tom, his messenger handed me the dark blue pants, light blue collared dress shirt with epaulettes, cross tie with a button snap, and flat black shoes. The name tag read, Jenna Miscavige, Trainee, CMO Clearwater. So it became obvious to me there was no mistake with the uniform. I was going to be in the CMO training to be an auditor. I had always dreamed of being in the Sea Org, and being in the CMO had been my plan for the future, but this had come on so suddenly. Not only that, I had wanted to join mainly so I could work at INT with my parents, friends, and family who were at the base, but now they were 3,000 miles away. I was speechless. The strangest thing about all this was that I knew I hadn't done the steps that were necessary to be in the Sea Org. Specifically, I hadn't done the basic EPF, the Estate Project Force, mandatory for all Sea Org members. The EPF was an introductory ritual for the Sea Org, and everyone who joined was required to do it as their first step to becoming a Sea Org member. The EPF was a rigorous boot camp of sorts, with some physical labor and a few intense courses. Even more baffling, CMO, where I was now going to be a trainee, had its own individual EPF requirement. I hadn't done that one either. In every way, this was premature. I changed into my uniform and went back to Tom's office. He laughed at the sight of me, saying, "Little Jenna is all grown up." When I told him how uncomfortable the situation was making me because I had bypassed the 2 EPFs, he told me not to worry about it, for now I was a Sea Org member. I wasn't sure if I should smile or burst into tears, but Tom didn't seem to notice my anxiety. He instructed me to go to the Coachman building to start the course. One of my first courses was called the Student Hat. I saw several people I knew in the course room, which made me feel somewhat more at home. My first check sheet assignment had me sitting in a chair in front of a wall that had an LRH policy bulletin taped to it. I had to sit and look at LRH's words for 1 straight hour. If I moved, got tired, coughed, looked away, or fell asleep, the hour would start over. The idea was that I was supposed to learn to be a good student, and that this drill would force me to confront the policies I would have to study in order to achieve that. Several people in the course room had been on this drill for weeks. Because I was the restless type and used to being up and about, I knew it would take me forever, too. Sure enough, I struggled to sit still. In terms of vocabulary, the entire course was so far over my head that it might as well have been in another language. I had to learn the 10 points of keeping Scientology working, verbatim, reciting it over and over to a wall and having it verified by another student. I also had to learn the 10 different ways a word could be misunderstood. Beyond that, I listened to 12 tapes of LRH's notoriously dense, wordy lectures filled with technical terminology about photography and printing, and read hundreds of his bulletins. After I had read a series of bulletins, I was put through rigorous testing of my knowledge with what were known as theory drills and/or what do you do drills. This meant another student would ask me a series of questions taken from quotes in the policies. What do you do? He might ask. Or, what are the 10 ways in which a word can be misunderstood? I would have to respond correctly and without hesitation in order to pass the drill. The shortest one I ever took was 25 questions, but they were usually between 40 and 100 questions in length. If you answered a question incorrectly, you would first have to finish the series, then start again from the beginning until you could do a run-through without a single flunk. As was standard for any Scientology course room, we would receive daily meter and spot checks. I would count the seconds until lunchtime, both because I was starving, as I never could get ready in time for the bus from berthing to have enough time before roll call to eat breakfast, and because it was a much-needed break. I ate lunch at the crew dining room in the newly refurbished Clearwater Bank building, right across the street from the Coachman building. I was so happy to see that Valeska worked there. We gave each other a huge hug and caught up. She told me she was no longer allowed to be in CMO because her mom was speaking out against Scientology, which made her unqualified for the organization. She was now a staff steward, so she was responsible for serving food and cleaning up after the crew. I was very uncomfortable in the crew dining room. Everyone had an assigned place to sit but me. All of the seats in the CMO section seemed to be taken. Whenever I asked if I could sit in an open spot, the CMO gals would tell me that someone else was there. I was so shy that instead of claiming one of these seats, I would just eat with Valeska and the rest of the galley crew at their table after mealtime was over. I didn't really fit in with the CMO group. They thought it was strange that I hung out with kitchen staff, so they kind of shunned me. When the course was over at 9:30, I caught the bus home and went to Valeska's room, only going to my room to sleep. If I got too scared in the middle of the night, I could still run across the apartment complex to Valeska's room and crawl into bed with her. I had to do my own laundry now, but I had no idea how to do it, since one of the kids at the ranch was always assigned to that duty. Valeska helped me wash and iron my uniform shirts and showed me how to do it myself. I didn't know what I would have done without her. After a few weeks, Valeska suddenly disappeared without even saying goodbye. Her departure was so abrupt. I was really worried. I later heard that she had been sent to the Free Winds, which would make it much more difficult for her mother to get in touch with her. Nothing about this return to Flag was panning out as I had envisioned it. My living situation, my routine, my courses, and my friends, none of it fit the picture that I'd created mentally, or the experiences that I'd had in the past. During all 3 of my previous trips to Flag, my enjoyment had stemmed in no small part from having access to my mom's lifestyle and leisure. Now, suddenly without that, I found myself at a loss, unsure of where I fit in and whether this was even where I wanted to be. In the past, Flag had reinforced my desire to join the Sea Org. Now, it was making me question if the CMO was what I wanted. Maybe I'd been wrong. I was 12 and making decisions that would impact the rest of my life, and there was no margin for error. The coursework was a source of anxiety because it was over my head. I did anything I could to get away from it. I preferred hiding in the bathroom stall or pretending I needed to look something up in the library. One day at lunchtime, Aunt Shelly, who had just come into town with Uncle Dave, sought me out in the dining room and told me to come with her to the executive dining room. In the hallway on the way there, she asked what my days were like. I told her that I mostly studied, then hung out with the galley crew during mealtime and in the evening before bed. At that she seemed appalled, but clearly recognized that I didn't know any better. "You know, Jenna," she said, shaking her head, "you never should have come to Flag in the first place. From now on, you will be hanging out with CMO and CMO only, going to CMO musters and being a part of that group. CMO staff does not hang out with galley staff." I took her words to heart. After the meeting, I was also pulled aside by Don's wife, Pilar, who was charged with getting me back on the rails. She told me point blank that I looked like crap in my uniform and that I needed to get one that fit. Right after my reprimand, she gave me a few of her own Egyptian cotton shirts, the special ones, only for executives. It was a little confusing how she could be so mean one minute and so nice the next. Even though the shirts were hand-me-downs, they were coveted because they were considered to be the best, so I knew how lucky I was to have them. After those 2 meetings, I started going to CMO musters after each meal, just as Aunt Shelly had ordered. I was assigned a place at one of their tables, taking the pressure off me to find my own seat. One day, not long after I arrived in Clearwater, the news that Don Jason had blown swept through morning muster. Blowing was taking off and deserting the church, a scandalous act equivalent to Scientology treason. Nobody had heard from him, and like those around me, I was completely shocked. He was one of the highest-ranking executives at Flag. I had just spoken to him in his office a couple of days earlier, and he seemed completely normal. He had relayed that my mother wanted him to check on me, which I thought was really nice. The flap this news created was enormous. It made me want to call Mom, knowing she and Don had been friends, but I didn't have permission to use the phones at the base. The phone system at Flag required a special code, which I didn't know, so I had been using my own system when I wanted to call home. I'd sneak into Tom and Jenny's apartment to use theirs while they were still at work in the evenings. I'd ask a Sea Org member who was in charge of the berthing for the master key, then let myself into their apartment. He trusted me because he knew me from my previous visits to Flag, having seen me with my mom, Sharni, and Valeska. He also knew I was in the CMO, so he thought that I was using the key for something like the laundry. Tom had once said offhandedly that I could use his phone any time, and I knew I was really stretching this, but I didn't know what else to do. The night we heard about Don's blowing, I sneaked into Tom's apartment and phoned California, reaching Mom through the RTC reception. I only told her I desperately wanted to come home. She seemed to already know about Don. I told her how sad I was at Flag, and that I was unprepared to be in CMO. Mom was surprisingly sympathetic, and said she would book a flight for me to come back to California at her first opportunity. 2 days later, on Wednesday, I got word from Mom that a flight had been arranged, so I packed and got ready to go. I sneaked into the galley, and with help from my friend who was a galley cook, we made a special cake for me to bring to Mom. I had already said goodbye to my other steward friends and was waiting in the kitchen for either Tom or someone else to pick me up and take me to the airport when my friend's phone rang. She looked a bit worried as she handed it to me. I instantly recognized the voice of Mr. Sandra Phillips, a high-ranking officer in CMO. She said I needed to come over to the WB immediately. When I explained to her that I was about to go to the airport to catch a flight back to California, she said there had been a change of plans and I was to get over there right now. Annoyed and worried, I dragged all of my bags down the block to the WB, went upstairs, and found Mr. Phillips, who took me into a small office and shut the door behind us. With her face bright red, she started screaming at me at the top of her lungs, spraying spittle in my face. I couldn't even believe this was happening. She yelled that I was unethical, or out ethics, as they say, a horrible student, individuated from the rest of the group, and not abiding by the rules. She ended by saying there was no way I was going home, and that I needed to toughen up because I was a Sea Org member now. All of this had come out of nowhere. Just when I was about to give her a piece of my mind, Tom's wife, Jenny, came in and told Mr. Phillips to get out, that she was going to handle this. Jenny had been promoted to commanding officer of CMO Clearwater, and I was sure she was going to sort everything out. She would undoubtedly help me to get to my flight. Instead, to my horror, Jenny also told me I was staying, and I could tell she meant it. Why? I asked her, completely stunned. You just are, she said dismissively. You came here to become an auditor, and so we were going to train you to be one. I tried to protest, but she shushed me and proceeded to read me a quote from LRH's policy titled Keeping Scientology Working. When somebody enrolls, consider he or she has joined up for the duration of the universe. Never permit an open-minded approach. If they're going to quit, let them quit fast. If they're enrolled, they're aboard. And if they're aboard, they're here on the same terms as the rest of us. Win or die in the attempt. We'd rather have you dead than incapable. The whole agonized future of this planet, every man, woman, and child on it, and your own destiny for the next endless trillions of years depends on what you do here and now with and in Scientology. As dramatic as this sounds now, at that moment, I really believed that the future of the planet rested on my 12-year-old shoulders. Much as I wanted to protest, there was no arguing with her words. Begrudgingly, I accepted, and my fate was sealed. I was not going home to see Mom. I was stuck here. Chapter 15. Mom. The sudden change of plan that had me staying in Clearwater was frustrating, but more upsetting was the fact that in the days that followed, I couldn't get in touch with my mother. In the evenings, I'd use the master key to get into Tom and Jenny's apartment to try to call her at the RTC, but whoever answered the phone would say she was unavailable. Despite my asking when I might be able to reach her, the answers were always vague and unhelpful. Finally, my father called me. He told me I needed to stop calling the RTC reception to reach Mom. When I asked him why, he said it was because she was on a special project that was keeping her busy. Even he wouldn't say what she was doing. I was beginning to worry that all of the secrecy meant that she had been sent to RPF, Rehabilitation Project Force. The worst punishment the church dealt out, RPF, was a type of reprogramming to bring people back in line. Often, they went to a segregated location on the base, usually for at least 2 years, but it depended on how fast they did their rehabilitation program. I couldn't imagine why she would have been sent to RPF. After all, Uncle Dave had recently promoted her to lieutenant commander and praised her in front of everyone at Sea Org Day. Still, she'd never been so inaccessible. I struggled to think of another reason for her absence. The day after I spoke to Dad, an RTC rep named Sophia Townsend pulled me out of my course room. When someone from RTC came for you, it was almost never a good thing. RTC was the most senior organization in the church hierarchy and played a huge role in enforcement of rules and standard application of LRH policy. Mr. Townsend took me into a room upstairs for what she called a quick session with me. When I asked her what she meant by a quick session, she said in a very unfriendly tone, I'd have to wait and see. She did the usual procedure of asking if I was tired or hungry, and if there was any reason not to start the session. I responded no to all the questions. "This is the session," she half-yelled, staring. She asked me several questions that were standard at the beginning of every session and pertained to whether I was upset or had my attention elsewhere. After a brief discussion of what was on my mind, namely everything going on with my mom, she moved on to the heart of the matter and the reason we were having a session in the first place. "Has a withhold been missed?" she asked me. She was trying to uncover whether I had done anything bad that I didn't want people to find out about. After confirming with the e-meter, she looked at me expectantly. "No," I said, as this seemed like a reasonable response. Mr. Townsend didn't like that answer. I tried to think of minor withholds I was guilty of, like the fact that I was using Tom's phone to call home without telling him. But I didn't want to tell Mr. Townsend that one, because she would tell Tom, and I would no longer be able to make calls from his place. "No," I said again. Apparently the needle still indicated I was lying. For a third time, Mr. Townsend asked me about a missed withhold. Again, my response was no. I could tell she was getting really annoyed. "Okay," she said. Have you robbed a bank? What? I asked in disbelief. No. How in the world would I do that? Okay. Did you kill somebody? The questions were preposterous. Are you serious right now? I asked. Yes, I am, she said with a hint of annoyance, even as she delivered the next question. Did you have sex with your father? What are you even talking about? I yelled back. Well, let's take a look, because you have something here. No, I don't, I insisted, adding I couldn't believe she would think that I could do any of these things. Mr. Townsend wasn't quite done. I will repeat the question. Has a withhold been missed? She said robotically. It went on like this for hours. An interrogation for something, but for what I had no idea. I couldn't understand why this was happening or what it was all about. Did it have something to do with my mom? What did I do wrong? Finally, when it was clear that we weren't getting anywhere, I simply refused to talk to her. She said we were ending the session so she could turn me over to ethics for no report, failing to answer questions that the e-meter determined I knew the answer to. Fine, I said, relieved to be out of the room, but also aware that I was in big trouble. I next went to the examiner, protocol after every e-meter session. Thank you very much, your needle is floating, he told me, as he always did. A floating needle was supposed to indicate that you were happy and relieved, but nothing could have been further from the truth. I'd never felt so on edge. Mr. Townsend told me to wait in the auditing room until someone from the ethics department could pick me up. From there, I was escorted to the WB while being given a scolding for not cooperating with Mr. Townsend. Soon we arrived at the WB, where in a few minutes I was met by another, more senior RTC rep, Anne Rathbun. I knew her because she had worked in Uncle Dave's office for several years and was married to Marty Rathbun, Uncle Dave's top lieutenant. She told me that Mr. Townsend's session had been too harsh, and another auditor was going to administer a new session. The next auditor, Mr. Angie Trent, also an RTC rep, was much friendlier. She asked a series of questions from a prepared list, and if the e-meter responded, she looked at me for answers. This session went much better. When it was over, she promised she would help me get some information about my mom's whereabouts. Difficult as it was, I tried to settle back into my courses. Providing some comfort was the fact that I had a familiar face to help me. Claire Headley had been one of my supervisors at INT when Justin and I had been twinning, and even though I'd struggled, she had always been upbeat and encouraging. She was older, but soon we had become good friends. Since then, she had been promoted to RTC, had come to flag as part of the team to enforce the new golden age of tech, and was now referred to as Mr. Headley. Despite our friendship, I had to call her Sir because she was now an RTC rep who was to be respected and feared. Still, she helped to get me back on track in my studies and calm me down. As weeks went by without news from my mom, Mr. Headley assured me she was really working to get information for me. One Saturday morning during Clean Ship Project, the time allotted to clean our dorms, Mr. Headley came to my room and told me that she and I were going to take a flight that morning back to INT to find out what was happening with my mother. I was shocked but happy. Mr. Headley was going to have a chance to see her husband at INT, so she was excited too, as they had been separated when she was sent to flag as part of the RTC rep team. We flew to LA and drove to the base. Mr. Headley delivered me to my parents' apartment and left as soon as Dad walked in, giving us some privacy. "How are you doing?" he asked as he reached over to hug me. I tried to maintain my composure, but as I opened my mouth to respond, I felt the tears start to stream down my face. A jumble of thoughts and emotions poured out of me as I told him how worried I was about Mom and how I still hadn't been able to reach her. I also shared my horrible session administered by Mr. Townsend. "I'm sorry about that," he said, looking me in the eyes. But what happened with Mr. Townsend was a standard procedure in a situation like this, uncomfortable but necessary. I pulled back, irritated that he took her side but also confused. Standard procedure for what? Before I had time to turn the question over, I got my answer. "Your mom has been having an out 2D, he said matter-of-factly. Essentially, this meant she was having an affair. As shocked as I was, I realized that this had been my fear all along. This was why I'd been afraid she was on RPF and why I'd become so upset about not being able to speak with her. This was why Mr. Townsend had been checking me for a withhold, to make sure I hadn't known anything about Mom's behavior. With who? I asked. Who do you think? Probably Don. Yep, that's right, Dad said. Did you know this was happening? The way he asked the question made me think he was accusing me of conspiring. I thought back to my session with Mr. Townsend and how intensely she'd checked me for a withhold. Only now, I could see that she'd been making sure I didn't know anything about my mom's behavior. No, I responded, but they were really close, so it made sense to guess him. Even to me, it had been obvious that they were more than friends, but I had no idea it had gone this far. I had a mental panic about the consequences for Mom. Those who went out 2D were looked upon as the worst of the worst. My mother was someone whom I had always looked up to. Despite what others undoubtedly thought about her now, I knew she had done many good things for the church and was still very capable. I wasn't about to forget that. But knowing she had done something as blatantly forbidden as out 2D made it difficult to rationalize. I purposely blocked as many feelings as I could. I separated myself from my emotions and tried to act completely logically and do what was right and necessary, not just react. Here was a situation where my TR bullbait training became particularly useful. It had taught me how to suppress my feelings and react not emotionally but rationally. I had to disconnect my mind from my feelings. Even in regular situations, something way less significant than learning your mother has been having an affair, if you reacted or got upset, other people would tell you to get your TRs in. If you got into an argument or got upset, you were told to use your TRs to keep cool. With my father's news, I used my TRs to disconnect. At that moment, the approach was helpful. While I attempted to keep my feelings in check, Dad proved unable to control his and started tearing up. He told me that he felt like the last 2 years of their marriage had been a lie, and that Uncle Dave had been nice enough to pull him aside to tell him about the affair himself. I gave him a sympathetic hug, as it seemed the right thing to do. "Where is Mom?" I asked, knowing well that policy stated an out 2D resulted in getting beached. The policy, written when the Sea Org was still on the ship, meant that the transgressor would be left on a beach. Now the person being punished usually went to the RPF. Dad confirmed this was the case. "She's on the RPF where she should be," he said without much warmth. "Is she doing okay?" He seemed shocked by the question as if it didn't matter. "I think so, but her well-being hasn't exactly been my concern. She completely betrayed me," he told me. "But don't worry. In the RPF they get meals and have a place to sleep, so I'm sure she'll be fine." I had always been a compassionate person who felt for people when they got in trouble, even if it was of their own doing. It only made me feel worse knowing that wherever she was likely being treated very poorly, without any of the importance or amenities to which she was accustomed. Dad, however, and somewhat understandably, seemed to think she deserved it. He must have put out of his mind that their relationship had begun with their committing an out 2D before they were married. Dad told me he was in the process of going through Mom's possessions and packing them to send them to storage, as she wouldn't be needing them again, and asked me if I wanted to help. People sent to the RPF usually spent years there. Even 2 years was considered a short stay. As we started going through her closet, Dad would hold up a piece of clothing and say, "Do you want this? She'll never need that again," insinuating that she was going to be gone for a long time. It was hard to know how I should react to all this. If I were following Scientology, the proper response would have been to hate her immediately, not because she'd jeopardized our family, but because she'd broken Scientology rules. What worried me, though, was that I didn't hate her. Sure, I was upset with her, but I didn't hate her. In fact, I still loved her. I knew that this wasn't the proper feeling to have, so I kept my feelings to myself. My silence didn't stop Dad from asking why I wasn't crying. He told me that Uncle Dave asked him how I would respond to the news, and Dad had told him that I would go apeshit. It annoyed me that he thought he knew me well enough to make such an assumption. Also, telling this to my uncle and making me sound like some sort of child, when in fact I was a Sea Org member now, just as he was, irritated me equally. After an hour of going through Mom's belongings, Dad had to return to work, at which point Mr. Headley came back, giving me a hug and telling me how sorry she was. Her sympathy made me tear up a little, as I felt as though she really cared. A few minutes later, Aunt Shelly opened the door. "Hey, I heard you took the news like a champ," she said. "Good for you." She gave me a hug and we walked outside to talk. "Your mom is okay and she's going to be okay," Shelly told me. "She always claimed to be the strongest woman on the base, so she will be fine with the messed work they have to do on the RPF." When I told Aunt Shelly that I was worried about my mom and that I didn't want her to be sad, she became much less complimentary. "Did you know," Shelly continued, "that the reason your mom wanted to send you back to Flag for your auditing classes was that she was looking for a way to stay in touch with Don?" Those words landed hard. I didn't know if they were true or just an exaggeration on Aunt Shelly's part. While I was still stomaching that news, wondering whether it was true, Shelly tried to explain why the RPF was the right place for my mom, stating that she had a history of this, and making it clear that she strongly disapproved of my mother's behavior. Aunt Shelly and I also talked about my future. She said she was excited about me becoming a messenger because she wanted me to get through my training so I could come back and work at INT. I loved that she envisioned me working where I had always dreamed I would be. We talked for an hour or two. She told me stories of growing up and working for LRH and what it had meant to her to be a messenger for him at the age of 9. Our time together ended and we hugged and said goodbye. For the next couple of days, I spent time with Mr. Headley at INT. She took me around the base and showed me all the cool things that had been happening since I left. The INT base was spread out over 500 acres. It had been a resort before the church purchased it in 1978, and still had a huge man-made lake, a castle, and an irrigation system that kept everything lush and green in the hot California desert. The entire property was surrounded by razor wire and hundreds of security cameras, some hidden but many in plain view. The recently added structure Mr. Headley showed me was a mansion called Bon View. It had been built for the day LRH returned and was ready for occupancy. "Like in another body?" I asked her, wondering how and when he would be returning. "I guess so," she replied, not seeming sure of the details either. We were given a tour of Bon View's interior by Stacy Moxon, a member of the household unit. This small section of CMO was on standby to take care of LRH's personal needs the moment he came back. The house was gorgeous, with brick walls and fireplaces, was surrounded by elaborate landscaping. It was by far the nicest building on the base. Taking in the full scope of INT was eye-opening, but I quickly grew tired of being there, reminded of the news of my mother's indiscretion and my father's grief. A few days before, I'd wanted nothing more than to escape to Flag. Now, after everything that had happened, I was relieved when it was time for Mr. Headley and me to return to Clearwater. It didn't matter to me what was going on in Clearwater or what my complaints had been with the CMO. I just wanted to leave INT and all those problems behind. Nonetheless, Dad insisted I return to California for Christmas. I did so reluctantly, staying at the ranch for most of the week. At first, I was annoyed with staying at the Cadet Org because I was supposed to be a Sea Org member, but my dad didn't view me that way. But after a while, being there made me long for my days before the CMO. I felt a connection to my friends at the ranch. They were the people who really knew me. I had grown up with them, and they implicitly understood who I was. At the annual Christmas beer and cheese party, I was with some of my ranch friends when Dad came up to me and quietly pulled me aside. "Uncle Dave wants to see you," he said, his voice brimming with urgency. "He is in the billiards room." I nervously found my way across the dining hall to Uncle Dave's private room. When I arrived, he started asking me questions about how I was doing, not really seeming to listen to the answers. After a few moments, he apologized. "I'm sorry, Jenny, for being so distracted, but I wanted to talk to you about something important." He let a pause pass between us as though he wanted to see how I'd react to his words. As they settled into the air, he continued, "Your mother has been asking me to see you." I was a bit surprised, as I hadn't heard anything from her in months. But when my dad said Uncle Dave wanted to speak to me, I figured it was somehow related to my mom. Uncle Dave seemed to be the only one who had access to her. Even though I was not angry with her, I could not get over the awkwardness that I would have to endure by listening to her confession about her affair with Don if I saw her. Turning over Uncle Dave's words, the truth was that I didn't want to see her. It wasn't because I knew that's what Uncle Dave wanted to hear, but because I didn't want to have to see her and talk about everything. I didn't want to sit around, rehash what she had done, and have to confront all the confusing feelings that this conversation would inevitably produce. I wasn't mad at her, I just wanted to avoid the emotion of the situation, as I'd been taught. I wanted things to be normal. "I honestly don't really want to see her," I said to him. "I hope she's well, and I want her to just get through the program. Once she's done with the program, we can put this whole ordeal behind us, and none of us will ever have to think about it again." "You're right, Jenny," Uncle Dave said, seeming relieved. "She does need to get through the program. That will be best for her. Maybe hearing that you think so will motivate her. At this point, she hasn't been cooperating." I wasn't surprised that she wasn't cooperating. On one hand, she was a senior-level executive who'd risen through the ranks and knew that following orders was the easiest path. On the other, she was a tough, often headstrong woman. The question was how far she'd be willing to go in her resistance. She knew as well as anyone that there were few alternatives. The only options were completing the RPF or leaving the Sea Org for good. "I want you to write her a letter," Uncle Dave instructed, "so that she can see that this refusal is coming from you and not me." He gave me some paper and I started with, "Dear Mom," but I didn't know what else to write. Uncle Dave gave me some suggestions, but he didn't want the letter to sound like it was from him. In the end, I kept the correspondence short, telling her that I still loved her, but I just wanted her to get through her program, as that would be best for both of us. "Thank you, Jenny," Uncle Dave said with a smile when I'd finished writing. "I'll make sure she gets this." The day before Christmas, I became extremely ill and wound up spending Christmas Day in bed. I had a high fever, swollen glands, and vertigo. Dad came to visit me and brought me a packet of Emergency and some cough drops. He even brought me an enema bag, telling me that Aunt Shelly said it was a good idea. I thought it was disgusting and told him as much. The day after Christmas, Dad said I was booked to fly back to Clearwater. He wanted me to come to the base to say goodbye to Uncle Dave and Aunt Shelly, even though I was still sick. We waited in the reception area of their office for a long time until they came out to meet us. Uncle Dave hadn't known about my illness, so there was a bit of an uproar about the possibility of his getting sick. With that, he hurried back into his office and only Aunt Shelly said goodbye, but not before insisting that my flight be rebooked for a few days later, so that I had time to get better. Chapter 16. On the EPF. 1997 began with me returning to Flag, just shy of my 13th birthday, and determined to forget about the previous months. For the first time, I didn't want to see either of my parents. I just wanted to push through my duties at the CMO and find my place. Of course, that was easier said than done. It was hard to simply put aside what had happened. I knew that it was best for me to separate myself from my emotions, but I couldn't bring myself to do it completely. Rationally,